Humanity had reached a point where life seemed ordinary, almost predictable. Every day, millions of people woke up, went to work, took care of their families, and returned home without thinking much about the bigger picture. Cities were alive with the constant hum of traffic, the chatter of people on streets, the lights that never seemed to sleep. From the outside, it looked like a world moving steadily forward, as if nothing could shake its rhythm. Governments functioned, markets traded, and technology advanced. On the surface, everything seemed under control, stable, and normal. Yet beneath this calm, there was a subtle tension, invisible to most, quietly building, like a storm gathering power on the horizon. Most people were unaware of it. They went about their lives focusing on what concerned them personally, paying bills, finishing work projects, caring for loved ones, or planning for the future. Children went to school, parents worried about raising them safely, and older generations hoped for peaceful golden years. The media often reported on strange incidents, protests, or conflicts in faraway places, but many shrugged them off. That doesn't affect me, they would think, and in this way, the growing instability in the world went unnoticed, overlooked, or simply ignored. Life carried on, oblivious to the dangers that were quietly accumulating. Scientists, researchers, and some journalists saw it differently. They were like watchmen on a tower, trying to alert the world to the dangers of ignoring inequality, resource depletion, and political corruption. They warned that humanity was pushing its limits too far, that the natural world could no longer support unrestrained growth, and that people's frustration would eventually boil over. Yet, their voices were often drowned out by louder, more immediate concerns: entertainment, politics, scandals, and the daily struggles of ordinary life. People wanted to believe in stability and progress, and so many dismissed these warnings as pessimistic or exaggerated. The cracks in civilization were already visible. If one looked closely, in some cities, neighborhoods were falling into neglect. Infrastructure, once reliable, began to show signs of wear and decay. Public services were stretched thin, and people who were already struggling felt ignored by the system. Corruption in governments and organizations often allowed a few to grow rich while millions suffered. Social inequality was glaring. Some had more than they could ever need, while others went without food, water, or shelter. The inequality created quiet resentment, small sparks that would later grow into fire. Yet most people continued their routines, focusing only on what touched their immediate lives, leaving the deeper issues unchecked. Natural resources, once plentiful, were disappearing faster than people realized. Freshwater sources were being polluted, forests cut down at alarming rates, and the climate was changing in ways that caused more frequent storms, droughts, and unpredictable weather patterns. Farmers worried about crops failing. Fishermen found the seas emptier than before, and communities struggled with shortages that governments could not always fix. These environmental pressures created tension and uncertainty. Even in regions that were usually considered safe or prosperous, people were beginning to sense that something was wrong, even if they could not name it, as though a shadow had been cast over the familiar world they knew. Amid all this, technology continued to advance at an incredible pace. The internet connected billions of people, and information traveled faster than ever. But instead of bringing clarity, it often spread confusion, rumors, and fear. Social media amplified anger and disagreements. While sensational news grabbed attention more than careful analysis, people started to distrust what they saw and heard. Conversations that once united communities now often ended in arguments. Even friends and family members sometimes found themselves divided by differing opinions, unable to agree on what was true or important. Humanity was slowly losing the ability to trust itself, to see the world as it really was, and to act together. Yet, despite all these warning signs, life for the average person still felt normal. A man walked his dog in a park, thinking about his work. A woman baked bread for her children, unaware of the shortages that might hit her town. A student studied for an exam, dreaming of a future career, not knowing that the world outside the classroom was becoming increasingly unstable. In a sense, the calm was deceptive. It gave people a false sense of security, making them believe that society was strong, unshakable, and safe. No one imagined that the world could change so violently, so quickly, and so completely. In some places, people did notice the signs, but even they did not grasp the scale of what was coming. Small protests broke out, demanding justice, fairness, or action on environmental issues. Leaders tried to ignore or suppress them, thinking they were temporary disruptions that would pass. Businesses tried to profit from the confusion, exploiting shortages or crises for their advantage. Even those who were aware of the dangers often felt powerless, believing that their individual actions could not change the course of history. And so, tension continued to build silently, invisible but real, like pressure accumulating beneath a cracked surface. The calm before the storm was more than just the absence of chaos. It was a fragile balance, a delicate illusion that life was stable when in reality it was teetering on the edge of collapse. Humanity was walking on a tightrope stretched over a deep chasm, unaware of how close it was to falling. Families, communities, and nations carried on as if nothing was wrong, while the cracks widened under the weight of greed, anger, fear, and ignorance. Each small failure in leadership, each ignored warning, and each act of selfishness added to the growing tension, making the world more vulnerable to a sudden explosion of conflict and chaos. Com was also a time of denial. People avoided thinking about the problems they could not solve. Governments debated endlessly, often prioritizing power and politics over real solutions. Companies chased profits at any cost, disregarding ethical responsibilities. Ordinary citizens focused on their daily routines, hoping that life would continue as it always had. And in this denial, humanity unknowingly prepared itself for the snap that was coming. Looking back from the perspective of the future, this period appears as the last moments of innocence. It was a time when humanity could still choose a different path, a time when action could have prevented disaster. But at the moment, almost no one saw it that way. People were too busy living their personal lives, too distracted to notice the growing tension. Even those who warned of the danger were ignored or ridiculed. The calm before the storm was deceptive, comfortable, and ordinary. And that ordinary life made the coming chaos all the more shocking. Humanity continued its daily routines, unaware that the world was quietly accumulating pressure. The cities thrived, the markets operated, and families lived their lives, all while cracks deepened beneath the surface. Everyone thought they were safe, that the ordinary world they knew was permanent. But history shows that this calm was just the quiet moment before the world would be forced to face itself in a way no one could have imagined. The stage was ready, the tension had reached its peak, and the first sparks of a conflict that would change everything were waiting to ignite. This phase of life, the calm before the storm, was crucial. It highlighted the fragility of civilization, the dangers of ignoring warning signs, and the quiet but unstoppable buildup of tension that could not last forever. Humanity, unaware and unprepared, moved forward with a false sense of security, walking toward a moment that no one would ever forget. The first signs of trouble appeared quietly, almost like tiny cracks in a wall that no one noticed at first. At first, incidents seemed small, unconnected, and insignificant. A protest in one city here, a riot over food shortages there, a heated argument turning violent in another town. All of these appeared isolated and almost normal. In a world where disagreements and conflicts were already common, people paid attention, but only briefly. They thought these were temporary problems, local issues that would fade away. No one realized that these small sparks were actually the beginning of a larger fire that would soon engulf the entire world. Yet, even in those small events, the tension was real. People were frustrated and angry, not just about one issue but about many things that had been building for years. They were angry at governments that ignored their needs, at companies that exploited them, at social systems that seemed designed to keep them powerless. These feelings had been simmering quietly for a long time, hidden behind smiles, polite conversations, and routines. But when someone finally acted out, whether by protesting, striking, or simply shouting their anger in public, it gave others a signal that it was okay to express their frustration too. Like a chain reaction, one act inspired another. The media played a role in spreading this tension. News outlets, eager for attention and clicks, focused on the most shocking events. Small incidents were turned into sensational headlines, spreading fear and anger far beyond their origins. Social media amplified this effect. Videos, pictures, and rumors traveled faster than facts, and people reacted emotionally before they had time to understand what was really happening. Ordinary citizens who had never thought about rebellion, protest, or confrontation found themselves drawn into arguments online and in their communities. Distrust and fear began to spread faster than anyone could control. Meanwhile, governments struggled to respond. Some tried to ignore the unrest, hoping it would fade away. Others attempted to suppress it with force, sending police or military units to quell protests, often making the situation worse. The use of force only fueled anger, creating a cycle of resistance and retaliation. Ordinary people caught in the middle grew more frustrated, seeing no protection from the very authorities that were supposed to keep them safe. Those in power believed they could maintain control, but every action they took, whether ignoring problems or using violence, brought the world closer to breaking point. Economies too were under pressure. Inflation was rising in many countries, unemployment left millions struggling to survive, and food prices were climbing at alarming rates. People began hoarding supplies, while others went without. Small businesses that had survived years of hardship were suddenly forced to close. Large corporations exploited the chaos for profit, often worsening the suffering of ordinary people. Economic inequality, already a source of quiet resentment, now became a visible spark for anger. Those who had been patient for years could no longer contain their frustration. The pressure on society was growing in every direction. Social, political, environmental, and economic. Communities that were once united now began to fracture. Neighbors who had once trusted each other started to argue, accusing one another of selfishness, greed, or betrayal. Families found themselves in conflict over survival. priorities, or opinions about the growing unrest. Even friends who had shared years together found themselves divided by differing views, unable to communicate without anger or suspicion. Small disagreements often escalated into fights, and minor incidents became excuses for larger conflicts. Humanity was learning, slowly and painfully, that the calm from the past could no longer be taken for granted. At the same time, some people tried to make sense of the chaos. Activists, journalists, and concerned citizens attempted to highlight the deeper causes of unrest. They spoke about inequality, corruption, and environmental destruction, warning that unless action was taken, the unrest would grow. But their voices often fell on deaf ears. Many people were too busy surviving, too tired from daily struggles, or too overwhelmed by the flood of information to pay attention. Others dismissed these warnings as fear-mongering or exaggeration. And so, the world continued to spiral toward its breaking point, even as the signs became increasingly clear to anyone willing to look. Rumors, conspiracy theories, and misinformation added fuel to the fire. People began to question everything and everyone. Governments were accused of hidden agendas, corporations were blamed for every hardship, and neighbors became suspicious of each other. Fear spread faster than understanding, and emotional reactions often replaced rational thought. Communities that had once been connected by trust and cooperation now became fragmented, each group suspicious of the other. Humanity was becoming a world of tension and suspicion, a world where anger and fear were starting to outweigh reason and compassion. Some regions experienced natural disasters, further stressing already fragile societies. Floods, wildfires, and storms caused destruction, forcing people to flee their homes or lose everything they had. Governments often responded slowly, unable to provide relief in time. The suffering of ordinary citizens became another spark of resentment, and the frustration with authorities grew. People began to ask themselves, if those in power cannot protect us, why should we follow their rules? This question, once quiet, now began to echo through cities and nations. Adding to the tension that was steadily building, it was clear to some observers that humanity was approaching a tipping point. The small incidents, once thought insignificant, were now merging into larger patterns of unrest. Riots and protests became more frequent, and the anger was spreading geographically and socially. Even those who were usually calm and peaceful felt their patience wearing thin. Humanity was being tested, and the stress, frustration, and anger that had been accumulating for years were reaching the surface. People could no longer ignore the inequalities, the failures, or the injustices that had built up quietly over decades. Even in ordinary homes, the sense of unease was growing. Parents worried about their children's safety, workers worried about losing their jobs, and communities worried about how far the unrest could spread. Conversations at dinner tables, once filled with mundane topics, now turned to arguments about morality, fairness, and survival. Everyone sensed that something fundamental was changing. The calm of the past was gone, replaced by a growing, simmering tension that no one could fully escape. People were starting to realize that the world was not as secure as they had believed. Humanity was still holding together, but barely. The first spark had ignited, and it was spreading faster than anyone could control. People were learning that the society they had always taken for granted, full of rules, routines, and stability, was not as strong as it appeared. The fractures were no longer hidden, where they were visible in streets, communities, and families. Trust was breaking down, anger was rising, and fear was spreading. Humanity was approaching the moment when the accumulated pressure would explode, and no one would be able to stop it. The time when small incidents began to escalate. That shows how fragile civilizations can be when tension is ignored. It teaches that even minor sparks, if left unchecked, can ignite a fire capable of consuming entire societies. People were no longer just frustrated, they were reaching the point where frustration could turn into action, into rebellion, into chaos. And although the full scale of what was coming was still unknown, the world was already on the path to a day that no civilization would ever forget. The breaking point came suddenly, as if the world had been holding its breath for decades and finally exhaled in a single violent moment. It didn't begin with a single event or a single person. It began with millions of people reaching the limit of their patience at the same time. Anger, frustration, fear, and desperation, all of which had been quietly building for years, now erupted together in a way that no one could have predicted. Streets that were once calm became arenas of chaos. Neighborhoods that had once been safe were suddenly filled with shouting, running, and the sound of things breaking. The world had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. It started with small, everyday acts of rebellion that quickly escalated. Ordinary citizens refused to obey laws they saw as unjust or meaningless. Protests that had been quiet before now turned into marches that blocked entire city streets, with thousands joining in. People shouted not just for their own grievances, but for everyone else who had ever been ignored, oppressed, or mistreated. The collective anger was overwhelming, and it seemed to feed on itself. One person's courage inspired another, and soon, whole communities joined together, acting as if they were one entity, one unstoppable force demanding justice and recognition. The authorities tried to respond. Police and military forces were deployed to control the situation, but their presence only intensified the conflict. In many cases, force was used without discretion, punishing people who were simply trying to make their voices heard. Those who were once law-abiding citizens now fought back, not just with words but with actions. Ordinary men and women, teachers, shopkeepers, and students found themselves standing against weapons and barriers, realizing that their frustration had reached a level where it could no longer be contained. The world was now in a state where rules, laws, and governments were failing to hold anything together. Violence spread quickly. What began as protests often turned into riots, fires, and clashes between groups of citizens or between citizens and authorities. Buildings were damaged, streets were blocked with debris, and communication networks struggled to keep up. Ordinary life was interrupted everywhere. Schools and workplaces were closed, stores were emptied, and transportation stopped. People who had once relied on order and stability found themselves facing danger in their own neighborhoods. The world was changing in ways that seemed sudden but were, in reality, the result of years of pressure finally finding release. Economic collapse worsened the situation. With businesses closing and supply chains breaking down, food, water, and essential supplies became scarce. Prices skyrocketed, and people who had once managed to survive now struggled even more. Desperation led to looting, fights over basic necessities, and a general breakdown of trust among people. Even those who had remained calm during the early stages of unrest were now forced to act for survival. Humanity was no longer dealing with isolated incidents. The chaos had spread to every corner of life, affecting people in ways that were immediate and unavoidable. Families and communities were torn apart. Parents struggled to protect their children while siblings argued over what to do next. Friends who had shared their lives for years found themselves on opposing sides of conflicts, each believing they were right. Trust, the glue that had held communities together, was disappearing rapidly. People became suspicious of each other, assuming the worst about neighbors and strangers alike. Small arguments that would once have ended quickly now escalated into long-lasting fights. The anger of humanity had a way of turning even ordinary life into a battlefield, and no one was safe from its reach. The media broadcast scenes of chaos around the world, further fueling fear and anger. Television, radio, and social media showed images of destruction, shouting, and violence, spreading the feeling that the entire world was unraveling. People who were far from the initial trouble zones began to panic, unsure of what was real and what was exaggerated. Misinformation spread like wildfire, creating fear where there had been none and intensifying the sense of hopelessness. Humanity was learning, through direct experience and through images on screens, just how fragile civilization had become. Amid the chaos, some extraordinary acts of bravery and compassion appeared. People helped strangers, rescued those trapped in dangerous situations, and risked their lives to protect others. These moments, though small in the scale of worldwide unrest, showed that even in the darkest times, humanity could act with courage and kindness. But these acts were often overshadowed by the sheer scale of anger, violence, and destruction. The world had reached a moment where extreme emotions controlled the actions of millions, leaving reason and patience far behind. Cities and towns became unrecognizable. Streets that had been filled with cars, people, and the sounds of daily life were now covered in debris, flames, and chaos. Shops and markets were destroyed or abandoned, homes were damaged or deserted, and hospitals struggled to care for the injured. The breakdown of order made ordinary life impossible. People had to navigate not only the danger of riots and violence but also the collapse of basic services, from electricity to transportation. Humanity's creations, from buildings to systems, were under attack from the very people who had built them. Driven by emotions they could no longer control, the tipping point revealed something deeper about human nature. Years of oppression, frustration, and fear had accumulated into a single, uncontrollable wave. People acted not just out of anger at immediate circumstances but out of decades of injustice, inequality, and neglect. The snap was not about one city, one government, or one problem. It was the eruption of collective human emotion, a reflection of how far things had been allowed to deteriorate. For the first time, humanity saw itself in the mirror, not as a controlled, orderly society, but as a species capable of immense destruction when pushed to its limits. Even those in power were unprepared. Leaders who had thought they could contain the unrest were shocked by the scale and intensity of the reaction. Orders and plans failed as people ignored authority and acted based on their own judgments and emotions. Attempts to negotiate or calm tensions were often too little, too late. The world was now in a state where control was no longer possible, and the collective anger of humanity had become an unstoppable force. Governments, organizations, and individuals alike had to face the consequences of ignoring the warning signs for too long. It was clear that the world had crossed a point of no return. Humanity had snapped, and the consequences were visible everywhere. Violence, fear, and anger had become the new reality, reshaping society in a way that would never be forgotten. Ordinary life, once taken for granted, had been replaced by chaos. The events of this period showed both the destructive and resilient sides of human nature. the ability to cause unimaginable harm and, in small but significant ways, the ability to show courage and compassion even in extreme circumstances. It is the point where accumulated tension, frustration, and fear finally found expression. Humanity was no longer acting as separate individuals but as a collective force, demonstrating both the dangers and power of emotions left unchecked. The snap was not sudden in its cause. It was the inevitable result of years of neglect, inequality, and denial. And as the world burned with anger and confusion, every person involved realized that nothing would ever be the same again. The day that humanity snapped became a turning point, a moment that would be remembered forever, as it revealed the fragility, strength, and unpredictability of human civilization. When the chaos finally began to settle, the world looked completely different. Cities that had once been bustling centers of life were now scarred and damaged. Buildings were burned or collapsed, streets were littered with debris, and landmarks that people had once taken pride in were broken and destroyed. The sounds of traffic and daily life were replaced by silence in many areas or by the faint hum of emergency sirens. The aftermath of humanity's snapping was visible everywhere, and it was shocking. People who had lived ordinary lives just weeks before now faced a world that felt unrecognizable, almost like stepping into a nightmare. The human cost of the chaos was staggering. Millions of people had been affected directly, some injured, some lost, and countless others traumatized by what they had witnessed. Families who had once felt safe at home were now mourning loved ones, some of whom had vanished in the chaos. Children who had played in streets or parks just days before were now witnessing fear, destruction, and loss. Survivors struggled to comprehend what had happened, trying to reconcile the normal world they had known with the extreme violence and anger that had erupted. For many, the emotional wounds were deeper than the physical ones, and they would carry the memory of that day for the rest of their lives. Communities were fractured beyond repair in many areas. Neighbors who had once relied on each other's support found themselves suspicious, bitter, or angry. Trust, which had been slowly eroding before the snap, had now almost completely disappeared. Small disagreements turned into permanent grudges. People realized that even within families and friend groups, the events had left lasting marks. Ordinary routines, going to work, sending children to school, shopping for groceries, were now complicated by fear, caution, and the uncertainty of who could be trusted. Humanity's social bonds had been tested to the extreme, and many had failed. Governments and authorities faced challenges they had never imagined. Cities that had once functioned with clear rules and systems now struggled to maintain basic order. Police and emergency services had been stretched beyond their limits, unable to respond to the scale of the destruction. Local governments tried to coordinate relief and reconstruction, but corruption, inefficiency, and fear slowed every effort. In some places, authority had almost completely collapsed, leaving communities to fend for themselves. Citizens were forced to adapt, improvising ways to survive, to protect themselves, and to find food, water, and safety in a world that no longer offered security. Economic collapse worsened the aftermath. Businesses were destroyed, trade stopped, and many people lost everything they had worked for. Banks and markets struggled to operate, and basic resources like food, water, and medicine became scarce. The combination of physical destruction and financial chaos created desperation among survivors. People scavenged for essentials, shared what little they had, or, in some tragic cases, fought over supplies. The world that had once run on commerce and organization was now forced to operate on human survival and immediate need. Even wealth and privilege could not shield people from the effects of the collapse. Everyone was affected, though in different ways. Among the destruction, the acts of human courage and kindness became even more visible. People risked their lives to help others, rescuing those trapped in collapsed buildings or protecting children from harm. Communities began to slowly organize themselves, creating makeshift shelters, food distribution systems, and networks of support. Strangers helped strangers, showing that even in the darkest times, humanity could act with compassion and bravery. These acts of heroism reminded everyone that despite the chaos, the human spirit could still shine through, offering hope amidst despair. But for every act of courage, there were countless stories of cruelty and betrayal. Some took advantage of the collapse to seize power, loot, or harm others. Opportunists emerged in the vacuum left by broken systems, showing how quickly morality could be overshadowed by self-interest when survival and chaos reigned. The aftermath revealed both the best and worst aspects of humanity, forcing survivors to face the reality that human nature could be both heroic and terrifying at the same time. The day humanity snapped had not only destroyed cities and systems, it had revealed the true extremes of human behavior. International communities tried to respond, sending aid, peacekeepers, or support where they could, but the scale of destruction was overwhelming. Borders were closed in some areas, while others struggled to manage the flow of displaced people seeking safety. Organizations that were usually able to coordinate relief found themselves hindered by broken infrastructure, political conflicts, or the sheer scale of need. The world realized how fragile civilization could be. A single day of collective anger had ripple effects that no single nation could handle alone. Humanity had learned, painfully, that order could not be taken for granted and that cooperation was essential for survival. Amid the destruction and suffering, people began to tell their stories. Survivors recounted what they had seen and experienced, passing down tales of heroism, tragedy, and endurance. These stories became more than memories. They became warnings, lessons, and records of what humanity was capable of when pushed to the limit. From makeshift radios to handwritten notes, from online forums to word of mouth, survivors shared their experiences, ensuring that the events would not be forgotten. These narratives began to shape a collective understanding of the consequences of anger and neglect, creating the foundation for learning from the disaster that, as the world slowly began to rebuild, it became clear that life would never return to exactly what it had been. Cities would take years, even decades, to recover. Communities would struggle to regain trust. Governments and institutions would need to reform, learning from the failures that had contributed to the chaos. People had learned hard lessons about human nature, the fragility of society, and the importance of vigilance, empathy, and responsibility. The aftermath was not just physical, it was mental, emotional, and cultural. Humanity had been forced to confront the consequences of ignoring tension, inequality, and warning signs for too long in some areas. The rebuilding process brought hope. Communities came together to restore homes, clear debris, and care for those affected. Ordinary people stepped into leadership roles, creating new systems of order and cooperation where old ones had failed. These efforts showed that even after unimaginable destruction, humanity had the capacity to rise, to adapt, and to create a better future. The chaos had revealed vulnerabilities, but it had also revealed strength and resilience, offering lessons that could help prevent similar disasters in the future. However, the memory of that day remained strong. For survivors, the aftermath was not just about rebuilding physically. It was about healing emotionally and psychologically. Fear, grief, and trauma lingered, reminding everyone that the events were real and that no one was immune to the consequences of human anger and collective unrest. The world had changed forever, and every person who lived through it carried the knowledge that civilization was fragile, that peace was temporary, and that the potential for chaos existed within everyone. The aftermath also sparked reflection on the causes of the chaos. Scholars, journalists, and everyday citizens debated what had led to humanity snapping. Was it inequality, environmental degradation, corruption, or simple human frustration? Most agreed it was a combination of many factors, all of which had built up over decades. People began to understand that ignoring problems, dismissing warnings, or relying too heavily on systems without moral responsibility could have catastrophic consequences. The lessons were painful, but necessary, and would shape the thinking of future generations. The world was in a state of cautious recovery. People had survived the day humanity snapped, but the memories of the destruction, loss, and chaos would remain forever. Cities would be rebuilt, systems reformed, and lives restored, but the scar on human consciousness was permanent. Humanity had seen what it could become when tension, anger, and frustration went unchecked. The aftermath was both a warning and an opportunity, a moment to learn, adapt, and strive for a society that could survive challenges without succumbing to chaos. The story shows that even after the most extreme disaster, humanity can endure and learn. The destruction revealed weaknesses, but it also revealed courage, resilience, and the capacity to rebuild. The events would not be forgotten, and they would influence every aspect of life moving forward. Civilization had survived the snap, but it had been forever changed, marked by the lessons of the past and the hope for a more vigilant and compassionate future. Even after the dust had settled and cities began to rebuild, the memory of the day humanity snapped lingered in every corner of the world. People who had survived could not forget the fear, chaos, and loss they had experienced. Families mourned loved ones who would never return. Neighbors remembered the betrayal and courage they had witnessed, and communities carried the scars of the violence that had erupted. The events of that day were no longer just stories. They were living memories etched into the hearts and minds of everyone who had seen the world change in an instant. Humanity had learned a lesson the hard way, and that lesson would not be forgotten. Rebuilding life was not easy. The physical damage was immense, but the emotional and social wounds were even more challenging to heal. Cities had to be reconstructed, basic services restored, and governments restructured to prevent the same mistakes from happening again. Communities worked together, pooling resources and skills to rebuild homes, schools, and hospitals. People who had once been strangers became allies in survival and reconstruction. Even in the midst of hardship, ordinary citizens showed extraordinary resilience, determination, and compassion. They proved that, despite the darkest moments, humanity still had the ability to come together and move forward at the same time. The events had sparked a deeper awareness about the fragility of civilization. People now understood that the calm and order they had always taken for granted could disappear in an instant. Governments, corporations, and ordinary citizens all realized that responsibility and accountability were essential. Leaders were scrutinized like never before, and institutions were expected to act transparently and effectively. The world had learned that ignoring problems, dismissing warnings, or relying blindly on existing systems could have devastating consequences. Humanity had been forced to face its own weaknesses, and the knowledge of that vulnerability became a guiding principle for rebuilding society. Education and storytelling became crucial in this phase. Survivors shared their experiences with younger generations, ensuring that the memory of that day would not fade. Schools incorporated lessons about cooperation, empathy, and vigilance. Books, documentaries, and articles recounted the events, explaining how anger, frustration, and negligence had led to widespread chaos. People told stories not only of destruction but also of courage, kindness, and resilience. These narratives helped communities understand the past and prepared them to prevent similar disasters in the future. Humanity had turned its memory into a tool for learning, making sure that the snap would remain a permanent warning in collective consciousness. International cooperation grew stronger as a result of the catastrophe. Countries that had once ignored each other or competed ruthlessly realized that survival depended on collaboration. Aid organizations, governments, and citizens worked across borders to share knowledge, technology, and resources. Agreements were made to monitor environmental, social, and political risks more carefully. Lessons learned from one disaster zone were applied to others, and global communication improved in ways that prioritized warning systems and rapid response. The snap had shown humanity that no nation could survive alone in the face of large-scale crises. Solidarity became more than an idea. It became a necessity. Even with all the rebuilding, scars remained. People who had lost homes, loved ones, or livelihoods carried emotional wounds that could never fully heal. Trauma was visible in communities, reflected in cautious interactions, lingering fear, and a general awareness that life could change overnight. Some people became more protective, distrustful, or anxious, while others became stronger, more resilient, and determined to prevent future disaster. The events shaped the personality of an entire generation. They were a reminder that survival depended not only on systems and structures but also on the choices and actions of individuals. Acts of courage and kindness from the chaos were remembered as well. Ordinary people who had risked everything to save others became heroes in their communities. Their stories inspired hope, showing that even in the darkest times, humanity could rise above selfishness, anger, and fear. These acts became the foundation of new values, empathy, cooperation, and moral responsibility. Communities honored these heroes in ceremonies, monuments, and stories. Their examples reminded everyone that while humanity was capable of destruction, it was equally capable of extraordinary compassion and bravery. The world also learned practical lessons from the disaster. Governments and communities developed better emergency systems, built more resilient infrastructure, and implemented policies to reduce inequality and social tension. Environmental preservation and sustainable development became urgent priorities, as people realized that neglecting the planet contributed to social unrest. Economic reforms were introduced to ensure fair distribution of resources, and social programs were strengthened to support vulnerable populations. The snap had revealed flaws in every aspect of society, and the response was comprehensive. Humanity was determined not to repeat the mistakes that had led to such catastrophic consequences. Over time, new leaders emerged, people who had experienced the chaos firsthand and were determined to create a safer, more equitable society. They focused on transparency, accountability, and collaboration, ensuring that communities could trust their governments. Ordinary citizens, having survived extreme conditions, became more engaged in decision-making and social responsibility. Democracy and civic participation strengthened, and collective awareness of social, political, and environmental issues increased. Humanity's snap had been a harsh teacher, but it also created an opportunity for renewal, growth, and lasting change. Memories of the disaster influenced culture and art. Writers, painters, filmmakers, and musicians drew inspiration from the events, exploring themes of human fragility, resilience, and morality. Stories of both destruction and heroism shaped how people thought about themselves and their society. Art became a tool for reflection, education, and healing, helping communities process the trauma while reinforcing lessons about empathy, vigilance, and responsibility. Humanity had transformed its painful experiences into lasting wisdom, ensuring that the snap was never forgotten. The emotional impact of the disaster also taught people about the importance of community and relationships. Individuals who had once lived isolated, self-centered lives now understood the value of connection, cooperation, and empathy. Communities that had been divided by fear and suspicion began to rebuild social trust. People shared resources, cared for neighbors, and looked out for each other in ways that had not existed before. Humanity had learned that survival depended not only on strong institutions but also on strong social bonds. The snap had shown that a society could fall apart in an instant when those bonds were weak, and so rebuilding them became essential. The world had changed profoundly. Humanity had survived the snap, but it was a changed species. People had witnessed the consequences of unchecked anger, frustration, and neglect. they had also seen the power of courage, kindness, and cooperation. Every person who lived through the events carried the memory of that day, ensuring that future generations would learn from it. The world was slowly recovering physically, socially, and emotionally, but the scar on human consciousness was permanent. Civilization would never be the same, and no one would forget what it meant when humanity finally snapped. The story concludes with both hope and caution. Humanity had endured and learned, but the lessons were hard-won. People now understood that society required constant care, attention, and responsibility. They learned that anger and frustration, if ignored or suppressed, could explode in unimaginable ways, but also that compassion, courage, and cooperation could rebuild what had been lost. The events of the day humanity snapped had become a timeless memory, a warning to never take stability for granted, and a reminder that every generation carries the responsibility to nurture, protect, and guide civilization. The story shows that even after unimaginable chaos, humanity can rise, adapt, and grow stronger. The day humanity snapped was not just a day of destruction. It became a turning point, a lesson etched into every mind, heart, and story. Humanity learned the importance of vigilance, empathy, cooperation, and moral responsibility. Civilization had survived, but the memory of the snap remained a permanent guide, shaping how people would live, lead, and connect for generations to come.